or by...
You're listening to What Ray's Saying, the podcast. What's in a name? What are you called? And how do you feel about it? Are there some names that sound uniquely Black American to you? Are there Black American naming conventions? Is it random? If it's not, what are they?
What's Ray saying? What's Ray saying? What's Ray saying?
From the source of all Black knowledge, thinking about the year, stranded on the mountain, looking to get out, planning more goals, seeking new challenges, nerve pain, peace and love. You're listening to What's Ray Saying, the podcast. What's in a name? A little history and commentary coming up. Black American naming practices and traditions were dramatically influenced by slavery. While slave ship manifests for the Atlantic slave trade recorded numbers and genders and approximate age of slaves, they did not record names. The practice of naming captured Africans didn't begin until the beginning of the international abolitionist movement around the 1820s as a way of pacifying abolitionists. So slaves or captured Africans were given anglicized names. Africans not born in America were often given new names as part of the seasoning or breaking process by forcing them to respond to these new names on order. This was less of an issue with younger slaves as they were seen to be more compliant, or those who were simply worldlier and knew the game. Now, slaves secretly called one another by their African names in slave quarters, but more typical, Black families who were repeatedly split and living in a foreign culture with a foreign language among diverse African ethnic groups. Along with this, and their owners suppressing African customs and religions, maintaining African traditions and names over generations was next to impossible. On the plantation, the general practice, slaves were given simple, single names. It should be noted while slaves were given names as a matter of work and service, in terms of records, they were often identified in the same manner as any other livestock, by age, gender, job title, and sometimes by their appearance. Typical names were Tom, Roy, Sally, Annie, Sometimes names were biblical, like Abraham, Israel. Probably not Moses, the idea of leading people out of slavery, but then again, consider the ironic names like Matilda, Pompey, Scorpio, Venus. Slaves were often given names of locations like York, London, and white family surnames as a first name like Davis, Johnson, and Smith. But only in the rarest cases that there were African names like Suleiman and Lewis. But you can consider that any surviving African name suggests that the slave was able to somehow communicate with their owners and gain enough respect to maintain that ethnic name. But this wouldn't survive across the generations, and it would be very rare. Now, the estimates are that most Africans brought to America were probably about 30% Muslims, maybe 5% Christian. But rarely were they able to maintain those names. So those numbers of slaves maintaining a name from Africa would be very, very rare. But whether those names were biblical, Muslim, or Christians really meant nothing at all to a slave. In some cases, a slave could be called a nickname or be given a name with an indicator like Sally's Bob, Jim's Bill, Snowball, Christmas, or even Smokey. If a slave was sold, there was no guarantee that they would be maintained by that same name. As a matter of practice, though, it was simpler for a slave to keep their single name that they had been trained to respond to. Last names were more likely to be changed as a formality of ownership by applying the last name of the master to all slaves owned as a title or label. But slaves were never addressed in this way. Most free blacks maintained this practice. But following the end of slavery and an attempt to normalize and formalize name identification, many former slaves adopted new names. And they were given a mixed combination of surnames that they could choose from everything from the master's name, towns, colors, and colors were very popular. Surnames for black Americans like black, white, brown, green, and blue are very common to this day. Presidential names like Washington, Jefferson, also very common. In the Jim Crow era that progressed across the entire country, both North and South, this being a system of discriminatory policies and social practices that reduced blacks to an inferior status in all phases of public life. As a form of social etiquette, white people could call blacks any name, and blacks were required to spawn regardless, for fear of being considered disrespectful and guilty of not knowing their place. That's a crime that could come with not just a beating, but jail or death. In these cases, blacks could be expected to be called by all kinds of generic names: boy, aunt, uncle, girl. George would be a specific example, with the Pullman porters, train attendants, and baggage handlers on the railroads and hotels and other services industries. All these working men, all in keeping with the social rules of social etiquette. Also in keeping with this etiquette, when black and whites referred to blacks, titles were not used that could contradict white superiority. That is to say, if a black was speaking to a white person, referring to another black, they would not use titles like Mr., Mrs., Doctor, or Reverend. Rather, they would use their first and last name or some qualifier such as the colored preacher, or the colored doctor, the Negro doctor, the black preacher, the teacher. Many whites simply refused to address blacks by any formal address and insisted in the best and most progressive of cases to use abbreviations or shortened their nicknames instead. This was especially popular in entertainment during the 20th century. Now, in the 1950s and 60s, Malcolm X became a prominent spokesman for the advancement of Black Americans. And he called himself X because Black Americans had no way of knowing their family's history. With the name X, Malcolm could be sure he didn't have a last name that a slave owner might have used. Some Black Americans decided to liberate their identity by intentionally misspelling a given name so that their name would be theirs alone and would never have been used by a slave owner, Dwayne being an example. In addition to their African heritage, Malcolm X also advocated conversion to Islam because, in his view, Christianity was the religion of white slave owners and a still segregated society. The civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s strengthened a sense of Black pride and identity. Black Americans began to discover more about their origins. The horrors of slavery and racism were exposed as never before. In the 1976, Alex Haley published the Pulitzer Prize-winning book, Roots, the Saga of an American Family. And Roots was later made into a TV miniseries that won 9 Emmy Awards. This series spurred an interest in the Black community to give children African names, or African-sounding names. And this trend to create African-sounding names led to the making up, in some cases, of totally unique names, and will start a trend in all new names in Black American culture. And by the 1970s and the 1980s, it had become common within Black American culture to invent a new name. Many of the invented names took elements from popular existing names and used prefixes such as La and Lee, Latuan, Lechuan, prefixes such as Da and D, Deshaun, Deshaun, and Ray and Ree, like Ray Trail or Retrail, or J and G, Janelle, Gnail, and suffixes and endings such as Equa, Isha, Twan, Uniqua, Nashika, Latuan, common in their sound, but not often common in their spelling. There was the emergence of Islamic names. They entered African American culture with the rise of the Nation of Islam among many Black Americans, with its focus upon Black advocacy. Popular names like Ashia and Aliyah became very common, and others are also examples of names derived from Islam. A number of Black celebrities adopted Muslim names, including Muhammad Ali, who changed his name in 1964 from Cassius Clay. Other celebrities like Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, who changed his name from Lual Senda. The civil rights movement, many Muslim names such as Jamal, and Malik entered popular usage among Black Americans simply because they were fashionable. And many Islamic names are now commonly used by African Americans and Black Americans, regardless of religion. Now, the dark side of unique names has manifested itself in some embarrassing examples of names with social consequences for the unique or unsuspecting parent and child. Names that are either misspelled, misunderstood, or mispronounced, such as vagina, venereal, gonorrhea, diarrhea. Now, this is highly qualified because typically names like that have a short shelf life during school, or families default to a nickname to make up for the error. So, my full name is Raymond Christian. I don't have a middle name. That used to give me quite an issue when I was in elementary school and middle school, and sometimes when I was an adult, and often get asked when I'm filling out some kind of form of document, excuse me, sir, you need to include your middle name, but I don't have a middle name. Maybe I should have gave myself one when I was a kid. By my family, and these are the only people left in the world that call me this, by default, my name is Junie. Junie is pretty common in the South for a boy to be given the name of the man that's supposed to be his father to be called Junie. I guess that's the same as Junior in the North. A series of nicknames that I had growing up as a kid, and some of them I resisted, like Nose. I don't know why people wanted to call me Nose. I guess because I have a very big nose, two very large nostrils on my face. But do I have a big face? I guess I have a big face or a big head. But I resisted Nose. I didn't like Nose, but a lot of people tried to call me Nose. Dirty. Probably deserving, but this is also a nickname that I tried to resist. I didn't like Dirty. I was commonly dirty, hanging with animals, especially in middle school, and fishing a lot, and just not really being focused on personal hygiene. I didn't like that, and especially by the time I got in high school, no. You know, hormones and stuff. Cornbread is a nickname that I tried to resist. There's somebody in the Army tried to push that one on me for a long time, and I didn't like that at all for what I thought it implied. He was really just trying to say I was backwards in country, but I didn't like that. Nicknames that I kind of stuck with me, and it was Catfish. And it's Catfish has stuck with me because, I don't know, my ability to give in to it, and it wasn't too bad. When I was a kid, I'm going to say some point in middle school, maybe 7th or 8th grade, I played hooky from school, and I went fishing, and I was fishing down on the James River in Richmond. It's down in there. There's some historic buildings and some street signs and tours and historical markers about the canal zone in that area of the river in the city. And I was down there, and I was coming back from the river, and I had, a long stringer of catfish on me. And I heard this noise, and it was the sound of all these kids beating on the school bus, and it seems an unknown to me, the class had went on a field trip down in that area, and everybody on the bus was beating and yelling and screaming and pointing at me, and so did the teacher. Of course, I ran off. I didn't drop my fish, though. Got back to school. Next day, kids were calling me Catfish, including the teacher. Initially, I didn't like it. And it got to be where I was hearing it so often that it started to stick. I started responding to it. It followed me all the way through high school. Made the mistake twice in the Army of mentioning either in a story or a joke or something that my nickname used to be Catfish, and it just people just loved it, and it seemed to reemerge and take on itself. So Catfish, Sergeant Catfish, Brother Catfish, start slipping in there. Nobody calls me that presently unless they know me from about 10 years on back, some periods of time in the Army. Maybe somebody who knew me from high school. When you're in the Army, you're enlisted man, Sarge is your nickname by default until you become, Sergeant First Class or First Sergeant, Sergeant Major, something like that. That was my name. I think next to Ray, I like Daddy, though, probably most of all. So this one is done. This is an unfunded podcast, researched, edited, produced, and hosted by me with special assistance from Dr. T. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Tell your friends about us. Share. You know how special it would be if I could get each one of my current listeners, each single fan of the podcast, to get 10 other people to just download it, share it, and listen. That would do a great deal for this little bitty podcast out in the podcast universe. I hear that 200 new podcasts per day are uploaded to iTunes. Where am I? Where are we? Where's this podcast out there in the sea of podcasts? Tell people about us. Let me hear from you. I need to hear from you. If you feel blessed and you want to donate to this broke podcast, by all means, please. Because this podcast makes no money. It costs me money. This is a love podcast. I am simply giving it to you because I love you. What other reason would I be doing it for? So take time to listen to the podcast. If you would like to see the podcast released more frequently, then I'd love to see that. If you'd love to see me take What's Ray Saying on the road for you, let me hear from you. That's what I want to do too. All right. Until next time.
You have been listening to What's Ray Saying, the podcast, hosted by Ray Christian. You can find What's Ray Saying on iTunes, Facebook, and Twitter. If you've got comments, questions, or feedback, you can always reach us via Facebook or by emailing whatsraysaying@gmail.com. Ray says each episode is made with love, fatback, chicken feed, and fresh mountain spring water, but none of these are legal tender according to the electric company. To help this listener-supported podcast pay the bills and keep producing episodes like the one you just heard, you can click on our Donate tab on Facebook or go to paypal.me/whatsraysaying. Tell a friend or 2 or 12 or 20 what you just heard on What's Ray Saying, the podcast. Until next time.
What's Ray saying? What's Ray saying? What's Ray saying? What's Ray saying? He will tell you about history. He will tell you about his story. He will tell you about what is happening, yeah. What's Ray saying? What's Ray saying?